We're going to try to start the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. We won't get through them all. Probably tonight we'll at least do an introduction to them and then finish them next week with 1st and 2nd Kings. So Ruth is an interesting book. We saw last week that Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges, and 1 Samuel takes place during the time of the Judges. The first so many chapters of Samuel begin with Judges ruling. Remember, Samuel is the ruling judge. Ruth is also taking place during that time. So some people have called this the transitional book historically between Judges and Kings. This is the book that is going to give us actually the theology of how we get our first king, that is the king in the line of Judah, David. So it's a very important book. Now, I like this quote that Rich Lusk and one of my friends, Yuri Brito, wrote about the book of Ruth. They wrote in their commentary, in just over 80 verses, God's whole redemption program for creation is summarized and it's enacted in miniature. So this is like a small book that shows a very cosmic and great gospel. The story gives us the gospel in the form of a short story. Ruth is a typological drama, as well as a Christocentric prophetic narrative, meaning this isn't a drama, this is a story that points to a type of who Jesus is, but it is also a narrative that's prophetic. It's pointing to the future, and it shows us how God will rescue his people. It's a romantic story, yes. This is a romantic text in Scripture, just like the Song of Solomon, but that's actually more of poetry. But this is fundamentally a theological romance because it points beyond the love that Ruth and Boaz have, and that's how most people teach this book. Husbands, love your wives like Boaz. That's usually how it's taught. That's definitely a part of the book. It's not the whole part of the book. So it points beyond that to the love between Christ and his church. And I think there's a lot of images of that in here. So hopefully you've turned to Ruth already, right after the book of Judges. And this evening I want to start by thinking about the title and authorship, and then the theology of the book. So we'll start with the title. So the title is named after the lead character, or at least one of the lead characters, Ruth, who is a Moabitess. She's a foreign woman. She is not an Israelite. Who is the important foreign woman in the book of Joshua that was in the line of Jesus? Anyone remember? Rahab. So she was a Canaanite from Jericho. Now we have a second important woman in the story of God's redemption, Ruth. A second important woman who's also a foreigner, a Moabitess, who are the enemies of ancient Israel, not the friends of Israel. And in this book, she is going to marry a man from Bethlehem named Boaz, who's a descendant of King David and, of course, a descendant of the Messiah. Now, this book is not included in the second section of the Hebrew Bible. So you remember, we have the Torah, which is the what? The law, correct? Second, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. We have the second section in the Tanakh. So the Torah, what's the second section? Navim, the prophets. That starts with Joshua and Judges. It does not continue with Ruth, though. Ruth is not found next in the Hebrew Bible. Ruth is not found until the third section of the Hebrew Bible, the Ketuvim, which is the what? The writings, which starts with Psalms and then goes to Proverbs. And then, after Proverbs, we have the book of Ruth. And I think there's a theological reason for that. So when we think about this, remember that this is in the third division of the Hebrew Bible, but it's in the second division of our English Bible and the Greek Septuagint in the historical section. So we say Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Those are all very historical books about Israel's history. But in the Hebrew Bible, when the Bible was first written and organized, it was not contained in history. It was actually contained in the writings, in the more poetic type sections. That's important, and I'll explain why in a minute. So let's talk about the authorship of the book. Jewish tradition has said, including the Jewish Talmud, that Samuel, the prophet, is the author of the book of Ruth. Now, the thing is, this book is anonymous. Just like we said, technically, Judges is anonymous, and even Joshua is technically anonymous, though we know it does say internally he wrote some of the book, and we assume he wrote most of it, if not all of it. This book is technically anonymous. But here's one thing about the tradition of Samuel being the author, and it's a big thing. Samuel dies before David becomes king. And Ruth chapter 4 is going to apply that David is king at the time of the book being written. So that might remove Samuel as being the author. When you look in chapter 4 of Ruth, verses 18 to 22, if you want to look there with me very quickly, you see a genealogy. And it says this is the genealogy of Perez. This is the end of the book. Now, in fact, if you'll look at verse 17, the book ends on a very positive note. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "There is a son born to Naomi." And they called his name Obed. Obed is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So David's an important figure by the time this book is being written. And then it goes and gives a genealogy. The genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon. Nahshon Salmon. Salmon Boaz. All right, there's our Ruth character. Boaz Obed. That's the son of Ruth and Boaz. Obed Jesse. And then Jesse David. So the point here is when this book is being written, David is a very important figure already. It doesn't say he's king, but I think it's probably written to justify his kingship, to show that he is the rightful king of Israel, and to show the bridge between the era of the judges now entering into the kingship. So there's also another reason why I think that we can kind of date this around there. If you look at chapter 4, verse 7, there's a custom that's talking about, it's a very short little custom in the idea of Boaz redeeming Ruth, which we'll discuss. So there is a custom in chapter 4, verse 7. It says there, "Now this was the custom in former times." So the author writing is talking about this custom like it was in the past, concerning redeeming and exchanging, to confirm anything. One man would take off his sandal and give it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. So when you're making a transaction, you would actually give a sandal to someone else as a statement of good faith, like, you're now in my shoes. This is my pledge to you. Glad we don't have that custom anymore today. I really don't want anyone else's shoes or sandals, but that was a custom in ancient Israel. And so the author is saying that was a custom, it's not anymore. So whoever wrote it lives after the time of Ruth, which would make sense if it's written during David's era, right? Because Ruth, again, if you look at the end of chapter 4, so Boaz and Ruth begot Obed. That's one generation. Obed begot Jesse. So Ruth is Jesse's what? Grandma. And then Jesse begot David. Ruth is David's what? Great-grandmother. It's possible she knew him, but how many of us knew our great-grandparents? Some of us were blessed to, but not everyone. And so it seems like that was you think about the customs your great-grandparents had, they were a lot different than the way people live in 2021, correct? Oh, yeah. Very different. So customs changed. So whoever wrote this, probably writing later, I think writing during David's time. It could be Samuel, but it's not guaranteed because of David's already rose to eminence. He's important at this point. He's no more a little shepherd boy. I'm assuming he's an important figure. Either he's killed Goliath at the least, could be king by the time this is written. This book also refers to the period of the judges as being a past event. If you look with me at chapter 1, verse 1, as the book opens, Ruth 1:1, it says, "It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled." This is a very important time mark. It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled. So whoever is writing this is saying, who doesn't rule anymore? Assuming we know what happens in 1 Samuel, probably during the time of either Saul, and David's been anointed king, David's killed Goliath, or David is now king, and this is being penned in for us today as scripture. So I would say that the book's written sometime around the year 1000. It's written sometime around David's kingship. And It's interesting that the New Testament cites this book as a historical book, as the Gospels do in particular, the Gospel writers in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, in the genealogy of Jesus, the book of Ruth is mentioned. The names of Boaz are mentioned there, and this genealogy is also confirmed in the Gospels. Now, when we think about this, I would say that this is a book of apologetics. This is a book defending the king of Israel as David, defending the tribe of Judah as the line the Messiah would come through. And when you read a story like this, you see that God is at work at like 1,000 different ways all at the same time. There's so many little details in this book that we can't flush out, but we did a whole sermon series on it, if you want to go back and listen to it last year. And there's like 1,000 things going on. But in that story of God doing all these things, he is preparing the way for Jesus. And every little detail in Ruth matters. So the setting of the book, it's after the Judges. I think it is important to say that it's a book it's written during, there's a king ruling, Saul or David. And this book is written after Proverbs. This book is arranged after Proverbs for a reason. Anyone remember, how does Proverbs end? What's the last chapter of the book of Proverbs? Book of wisdom. Proverbs chapter 31. Now you know, right? The virtuous woman. Who can find a virtuous woman? Every Mother's Day, in some church, a pastor preaches Proverbs 31, and all the women roll their eyes and get upset at the pastor, okay? And right after that, the book ends. So we have this beautiful picture of this woman of wisdom, a woman of virtue. So right after Proverbs, in the Hebrew Bible, comes Ruth. Now, why is that interesting? Well, the book of Ruth, chapter 3, verse 11, it says there, "My daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask," Boaz is speaking, "for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a" what? Worthy or virtuous woman. Same connotation with the Hebrew word there. And so I think that Ruth is theologically showing us what the Proverbs 31 woman looks like, which is very helpful to me for a lot of reasons. Number one, Ruth was married twice. Ruth had been a foreigner. She had worshipped false gods at one point in her life. Ruth was not a snob. What did Ruth have to do? Go out and work in the fields and get dirty and sweaty. But she was a woman of high character. She was a woman of obedience. She was a woman of virtue. That really encourages me, because I think when we think of the virtuous woman, we think of a great-grandmother in a hoop dress in a church, and we have this really weird image of something prudish that's not at all what Proverbs 31 is getting at, okay? And I wish I had more time to beat that drum, but I don't tonight. So, what is the purpose of Ruth? Well, one of the purposes, I think, is to showcase God's steadfast love. There's a Hebrew word in the Bible, chesed, and it means faithfulness, covenant love, steadfast love. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. It's an Old Testament Hebrew word. And this word is kind of a theme in the book of Ruth. So, for instance, as the book begins, Naomi was the lead character with her husband, and her husband had died. There was a famine in it. Let me back up. There was a famine in Israel. Naomi left the land of Israel because of the famine with her husband, and they went to a foreign land, to Moab, because of this terrible famine, which shows us Israel was under judgment. This was not a good time for Israel. It's the period of the Judges, a lot of sin. And her sons, two boys, marry two foreign women from Moab. Now, sadly, Naomi's husband dies, and then her two sons die. So it's a catastrophic loss for this woman. She's lost her whole family. She's a widow. All she's got left is two daughter-in-laws. And she's going to try to send them back to Moab. She's going to go back to Israel because she wants them to be able to get married and have a good life. Notice in Ruth 1:8, Naomi says to her two daughter-in-laws, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly. May the Lord show chesed to you, covenant faithfulness to you. Loyal love, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Later on in chapter 2, the famine continues on, And Naomi comes back to Israel, and she brings Ruth with her. Ruth promises to be faithful to Naomi. Ruth goes out and does the hard work to get food, working in the field so her and her mother-in-law can live. And Ruth finds out that there is a descendant, a relative of Naomi there. Someone who could possibly marry her. Someone who could redeem their household. So in Ruth 2 verse 20, Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, may Boaz be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness, same Hebrew word, Chesed, has not forsaken the living or the dead. So notice here, first, she prays that Yahweh, the Lord, would deal Chesed, kindly, faithfully, loyal love with Ruth. And now she says, may the Lord show Chesed to Boaz, because he has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said, this man is a close relative of ours. He's one of our redeemers. He can change our lives forever. And then in chapter 3, verse 10, when Ruth comes and is seeking marriage, of course, in that chapter by Boaz, because in obedience to Naomi, we read there, Boaz says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness, Chesed, mercy, loyal love, greater than the first, in that you have not gone after the young men, whether poor or rich. So Ruth could have, evidently she was an attractive woman, and she was younger than him. She could have tried to find a younger man. Maybe Boaz wasn't the best looking guy in the tribe of Bethlehem, okay, in the tribe of Judah. And he's saying, you could have went after a younger man, a man with money. You chose to come after me. You've shown loyalty. Just like Boaz showed loyalty to her, she's showing covenant love and loyalty. So I think we're supposed to see the faithfulness of God in this book, in the midst of a dark period, the period of Judges. So again, a few points here. It's tracing the ancestry of David back to Judah and Bethlehem. It's showing us something else, and I think it's showing us that God cares about Bethlehem, and it is a continuation of the Levite narrative of Judges. So I want you to turn back to Judges for a minute. I want you to turn to Judges chapter 17, the book before. The book ends, if you remember, we said last week, with some really harsh stories about Levites and the tribe of Benjamin. Levites and the tribe of Benjamin. Does anyone remember what king was from the tribe of Benjamin? Saul. We saw that. Saul. And later, of course, Paul was also a Benjaminite, the apostle. Saul was not the rightful ruler of Israel. He was not supposed to, his line was not going to be the line that Jesus would come from. It's interesting that Judges ends with two bad stories about Levites and about the tribe of Benjamin. So look at 17 verses 7 and 8. There was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite and was staying there. This man departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. Then he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and he journeyed there. If you will look down at verse 10, Micah said to this man, dwell with me and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance. So the Levite went in. Full stop, right there. Levites are not supposed to be personal priests to someone who's wealthy. He is taking his ministerial duties and he is selling them for money in a home. Where are Levites supposed to be priests at? The tabernacle at this time. That would be like me saying, you know what, I've decided I'm not going to be a pastor anymore. I'm going to find a rich family and I'm just going to be that family's pastor. So, by the way, a lot of churches live like that, unfortunately. One family rules the roost, and the pastors are their slave and does exactly what they tell them to do, to the detriment of everyone else, because that family has money, influence, age. They've been there a long time. So, nothing new, but this is a bad story, right? This is corruption. And the book of Ruth is redeeming the Levites and Bethlehem. That leaves you with a bad taste of Bethlehem. And the book of Ruth says, actually, there was a man named Boaz from Bethlehem who was righteous. He was covenant faithful. He was a man of chesed, of faithfulness and loyal love. And so I think that's one reason why Ruth is here. A second reason, if you'll go to chapter 19 for a minute, chapter 19, there's another terrible story. 19 verse 1, it came to pass in those days there was no king in Israel, and there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, but his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there 4 whole months. So this is not good, right? A Levite's picking up a prostitute, and then she goes and cheats on him. What a surprise. What a shocker, right? She's unfaithful to him. She's a prostitute, all right? Now, the story continues on. I don't have time to read the whole story, but basically, if you'll jump down to verse 10, the man was not willing to spend the night in the town he was at, so he arose and departed and came opposite Jebus, that is the city of Jerusalem. With him were 2 saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And then, look at verse 12. His master said, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners, who are not of the children of Israel. We will go to Gibeah." So the tribe of Gibeah is in Benjamin. Now, if you remember, we ended last week, we talked about the story of that concubine, that woman that was cut up in all those pieces and sent out to all the tribes. Well, when you read this story, this Levite goes to the city of Gibeah in Benjamin, and you can read the whole chapter on your own. We got to keep moving, so I want to give you the summary. So he goes there. Men of the city force themselves into the house, and you know what he says? "Take my concubine." And they literally rape her all night long, and they kill her. All right? Gang rape her and kill her. It's a horrible story. It looks very bad on the tribe of Benjamin. And so this Levite takes her dead body, cuts it up, sends it out throughout all the tribes of Israel to say, look how wicked these Benjaminite men are. And then a civil war breaks out. Remember, the book ends with a terrible civil war. All the tribes of Israel fight against the tribe of Benjamin. And so I think Ruth picks up, and again, this is showing us that while there were 2 Levites from Bethlehem who disgraced their town, and one, he's for sale as a minister, and the other is immoral as a minister. But it's showing us that just because there's 2 wicked men from that tribe doesn't mean they're all wicked. Actually, there's a very godly man named Boaz, and from him is going to come a godly man named David, who will be the king of Israel. So, in that city of Bethlehem will produce King David and, of course, later Jesus. So it's an important city. So, let's talk about the theology of the book. You see great important points in this book. You see God loves Gentiles. He redeems Ruth, a Moabitess. You see the work of a kinsman redeemer. The Hebrew word is a goel, someone who can buy back land, who can marry someone who's lost their spouse, who can avenge someone who's been mistreated or done wrong. So redemption is kind of the heart of this book. Now remember, I said the theology of the book is loving kindness, the Chesed. Redemption is connected to the loyal love, the Chesed of God in this book. So over and over we see the idea of a goel, or the verb gaal, a redeemer. 23 times in the book of Ruth we read about redemption, or a redeemer, or a goel happening. And so this book is all about God redeeming a bad situation, God redeeming a pagan woman, God redeeming a widow who was brokenhearted, whose husband and children had died, and restoring them. And I think that the situation here of Naomi and Ruth is a picture of Israel in the season of Judges. So in Judges, they are without a king. Naomi and Ruth are without a husband. Israel, everyone does what is right in their own eyes. It's a desolate, bankrupt nation during the season of the Judges. In the same way, Ruth and Naomi are desolate and bankrupt. But at the end of the book, they are fulfilled, they are cared for, they are protected. Ruth is proof that God will not abandon his people. He has loyal love, covenant faithfulness to his people. So it's interesting. The first space of covenant faithfulness we see is in Ruth chapter 1. Remember, Naomi says, I pray the Lord will show chesed to you, loyal love, covenant faithfulness to you. Go back to Moab and marry a man there. Look what Naomi says, or what Ruth says in return. Ruth says to Naomi, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." So she's renouncing Chemosh, Baal, Asherah, all the gods of the Canaanites and the Moabites. And Naomi is saying the God of Israel is who she will, Ruth is saying the God of Israel is who she will worship. Now the book starts out with Naomi saying the God of Israel is against me. Do you remember how the book begins? It begins with Naomi saying, God killed my husband and my children. He's against me. And in spite of that, so Naomi's a terrible evangelist. She's a faithless follower. And yet, in spite of all of the negative press that Naomi gives for the God of Israel, Ruth says, your God will be my God. We call that irresistible grace. The work of the Holy Spirit overcame her heart. God's covenant love in spite of a very bad testimony of Naomi, God overcame the resistance. This is like what Jesus said. All that the Father gives to me will what? Will come to me. And whoever comes to me, I won't cast out. Or in John 6:44, where Jesus said that that no man could come to me unless the Father which sent me what? Draws him. So that's definitely what we're seeing here. So Israel needs a king, but not like the sons of Naomi or the husband of Naomi. Not like Elimelech and not like Saul. Israel needs a king like Boaz and like David. And the world needs a greater Boaz and a greater David, Jesus. So I think there's a lot of pictures and types in the Bible, and in particular in this book. So think about this. Jesus loves his bride, the church. Jesus dies on the cross for his bride, the church. Blood and water flow from his side. After his death, he sleeps in the tomb for 3 days. Then he rises again, and now he has a bride, the church. I think this is symbolic, or this event is symbolized in the Old Testament. Adam is put to sleep by God. It's like he dies. And when he awakens, God takes something from his side and forms a woman, his bride, Eve. In the same way, in this book, if you remember in chapter 3, Ruth sneaks into Boaz's room at night. Boaz is what? He's asleep at the threshing floor. He awakens, and what does he find there? His bride, Ruth, there. So Naomi needed a new Adam, and Ruth is asking Boaz to be this new Adam, to be the provider. And then Jesus, of course, is our new Adam. From his death, from his side, from his death and resurrection, we become the church. We also need a kinsman redeemer. So Boaz has to buy back the land of Naomi. Boaz has to redeem Naomi and, of course, redeem Ruth. And that's exactly what Jesus does. Jesus redeems us from our sins. He buys back. He pays the punishment for our sins. The inheritance we lost in the Garden of Eden is won by Christ on the cross. Remember, Ruth, the book of Ruth starts out with exile. Naomi and her husband and her 2 sons are exiled from the land of Israel. Correct? Because of the famine and the judgment. And now we are no longer exiled. We are restored. We are the people of God. We are together in a spiritual Israel. And one day we will in the new creation. So in closing, and then I'll take some questions. How is Jesus a greater Boaz, a greater David, the kinsman redeemer we all need? How do you see Jesus in this book? Well, first off, the kinsman redeemer, the one who would buy back the relative and the land, had to be a family member, right? Jesus added humanity to his Godhead when he entered the earth. He became the second Adam so he could be our kinsman, our redeemer. Secondly, the kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying family members out of slavery, out of debt. Jesus redeemed us from our debt, our slavery to sin, to death, and to Satan. That's exactly what Jesus did. He bought us and redeemed us out of that. The kinsman redeemer had the duty of buying back land that had been forfeited. Jesus will redeem the earth one day. When he returns at the second coming and he sets up the eternal kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth, he's going to redeem this broken world forever. Boaz, as a kinsman redeemer to Ruth, was not motivated by self-interest. What was he motivated by? His love for Ruth, his chesed, his loyal love for Ruth. Jesus' motivation for redeeming us was not what he would get out of us, correct? It was his love for us. God, in this way, loved the world. God shows his love toward us. Romans 5:8. Boaz, as a kinsman redeemer to Ruth, took her as a bride. The people Jesus takes to himself are his bride. So Ruth is this very important book that's redeeming the tribe of the city of Bethlehem, the tribe of Judah and Levi. It's a book that shows us the transition from judges to kings, the kings of Israel. And it's a book that justifies and shows us why David is the rightful king from the tribe of Judah. So, any questions as we've introduced this tonight? Any questions at all about the book of Ruth? I know you all, most of you here, listened to a 8-part sermon series through it not too long ago, but questions on it at all? So you're all just going to be quiet, and we're going to move on to Samuel. So go ahead and turn to the book of 1 Samuel, please. 1 Samuel. All right, so as we jump into 1 and 2 Samuel, it's important to say that 1 and 2 Samuel originally one book. There wasn't 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. There was just the book of Samuel. And that, if you remember, a couple hundred years before Jesus, the Hebrew Bible was translated into what language? Greek. And we call that Greek translation the what? The Septuagint, which is abbreviated as the LXX. When it was translated into Greek, the book of Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, are both long books. And so you couldn't fit both of them on one scroll in Greek, so they split it up into 2 different scrolls. And it became 2 separate books, though it was actually originally one book in the Hebrew Bible. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, it's interesting, it's not called in the Septuagint, it was not called 1 and 2 Samuel. It was actually called 1 and 2 Kings. And then the books of 1 and 2 Kings were called 3rd and 4th Kings. Actually, to be more specific, the Greek word was basilion. It's the word kingdom. So 1 Samuel in the Hebrew Bible is called 1st Kingdom. And 2 Samuel is called 2nd Kingdom. And the book of 1 Kings is called 3rd Kingdom, and the book of 2 Kings is called 4th Kingdom. So different titles in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are a part of the Navim, the prophets. Remember, Ruth is in the Ketuvim, the writings, after the book of Proverbs. But in the Hebrew Bible, it goes the Pentateuch, Genesis and Deuteronomy. Then it goes Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Then it jumps into what we call the prophets, like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the 12 minor prophets. Chronicles ends up in the Ketuvim, in the writings, and we'll get to that later, maybe next week, possibly, or the following week. But right now, just think of it this way. Originally, 1st and 2nd Samuel were one book. In the Septuagint, they're called 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 1st, 2nd Kings are called 3rd and 4th King, or 1st, 2nd Kingdoms, and then 1st and 2nd Kings are called 3rd Kingdom and 4th Kingdom. Now, the title Samuel becomes very popular during the time of Jerome, and he was a Bible translator of the Latin Bible. And Samuel, of course, is going to play a very important part in the book because he's going to anoint the 2 kings of 1st and 2nd Samuel, Saul and David. And he's going to be at the beginning of this book. What is Samuel's role? What was he? He was 2 things. Well, he was in a sense a prophet, that's true. But more so than a prophet, what was he? He was a priest and he was the last judge. That's right. He's the last judge of Israel. And unlike the other judges, he judges the entire nation of Israel, not just a portion of Israel. So there's a definite distinction there. So why is this book written? I want to start with a quote from Thomas Constable. He has written, "The main purpose of Samuel seems to have been to record the establishment of kingship in Israel and to explain its theological significance." So it is a historical book. We're going to go from Moses, Joshua, Judges, now we're in Kings. So the book was ruled, the first off, Israel was led by one man, Moses. Moses appointed elders under him. Then Joshua became the leader. Then there was a bunch of judges scattered throughout ancient Israel. But now we're going to get kings, starting here with Saul and then David. But it also has a theology behind kingship. It deals with the Israelites' initial request for a king, the establishment of that first king, Saul, and the tragic results of having a king from Benjamin like Saul. And then we'll explain how the power is consolidated under a second king, David, and God's promises to him and some of his sinful actions later in his life. The climax of the book comes in 2 Samuel 7, where God gives a new covenant. What we're going to see is there's a lot of covenants in the Bible. Can you think of the first covenant, maybe, that's recorded in Genesis? First covenant we call the Edenic covenant, or the covenant of grace God makes with Adam, right? You can eat of every tree of the garden. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, though. And then be fruitful and multiply, right? And he also says to have dominion and to rule. So that's the covenant of works. Excuse me, I think I might have said grace, but the covenant of works. That's the first covenant. And then after that, we have a covenant of grace in Genesis. Because God does not kill Adam when he breaks the first covenant. Instead, what does he do? Kills an animal, gives him clothing, and removes him from Eden. He can no more eat of the tree of life. What's the next covenant after that? The next big one in Genesis? Too far. A little earlier. Before Abraham. Noah, right. So at the flood, after the flood, God makes a covenant in Genesis 9 with Noah about the shedding of blood in government. After that, what was the one you said? Genesis 12. And then repeated in 17 and 22, the Abrahamic covenant. God makes a covenant with Abraham. I will bless those who bless you, curse those that curse you, and you, all the nations of the earth, will be blessed. You'll have land, seed, and blessing. All right? After that, the next covenant is the Mosaic covenant, right? So the next covenant happens, and if you remember, God gives the law in the book of Exodus as a covenant, okay? And we have the Ten Commandments given, and so on and so forth, right? The whole law, moral, civil, and ceremonial. Now, we are at a new covenant in 2 Samuel 7. We have the Davidic covenant, where God is going to tell us how he is going to bring Jesus into the world, the Messiah into the world. He is going to bring the Messiah through David's line. So that is the heart of the book, really. When you get to 2 Samuel 7, that's the highlight point. That's going to set the tone for the rest of the Old Testament. So the writer or writers of 1 and 2 Samuel were trying to show us very clearly who would be the rightful king of Israel and Judah. It's David, and it's David's line. So let's talk about the authorship of the book for a minute. Again, like Ruth and like Judges, the author is anonymous. So we don't know who actually wrote the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, which was the book of Samuel, originally one book. Many people will suggest that Samuel was the author. He's the first important character of the book. We do know that he probably wrote much of the document. But again, why do you think he couldn't have wrote the whole thing? He dies in the book, twice actually. So it's impressive when you can die twice in one book. But his death is recorded twice. So in 1 Samuel 25, and Samuel died, and Israel assembled and mourned for him. 1 Samuel 28, Samuel died, and all Israel mourned for him. And there is a little distinction between these two. Notice that in the second account, there's a theological reason given for his death. After Samuel died, it says that Saul had put the mediums are people who are doing fortune-telling, dark magic. They're speaking to spirits, right, and trying to get messages from spirits. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you could think of the psychic hotline, or you could go down to New Orleans and just walk around Jackson Square, and you'll see them all out there. Palm readers, this kind of a thing, yeah. And then he also put the necromancers. That is a more particular statement and an important statement. All right, that's a big cockroach up there. That's what you're hearing. So, the necromancers. Does anyone know who they were? That's kind of a technical term. Who are necromancers? People that speak to the dead. So these are people that actually try to consult the dead and speak to the dead. He put them out of the land. It's a very important verse. But the point here is Samuel dies twice, so he probably didn't write the whole book. I think it's very doubtful because he wasn't alive during the second half of really most of David's life and rule as king. Now, we know from 1 Samuel 10:25 and 1 Chronicles 29 that Samuel recorded his own version of these events. So we can assume that his writings found a home in here. So in other words, this book is probably written by different authors. There's different people, editors, and then it was all compiled together into one history of the first two kings of Israel. So for instance, in 1 Samuel 10:25, Samuel told the people the rights and duties of the kingship. He wrote them a book, and he laid it up before the Lord. Then Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his home. So maybe he wrote those introductory chapters to the book. And then later in 1 Chronicles 29, we mentioned this verse last week in Judges. The chronicler says the acts of David were written in the chronicles of who? Samuel the seer, Samuel the prophet, in the chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and the chronicles of Gad the seer. So the writer of Chronicles seems to be implying that maybe there was three authors to the story of David's life. And it was these three different prophets. So even though the book's called Samuel, he's not the only author. I'm assuming that Nathan may have been an author. Gad the seer might have been an author. There might have been other editors as well. But I think that Samuel had a part of it, but he was not the main one. Now, there's an expression that's used in the book a lot that indicates the author is telling us events that happened in the past. In other words, when the author's writing, he's not writing in the present day, which again would point more towards not Samuel being the main author. So for instance, the first few sections of 1 Samuel deal with the Ark of the Covenant and the season of the Judges. And if you remember, in one season, Israel they started to treat the Ark of the Covenant like a good luck charm, which we all do, right? What are Christian good luck charms today? Crosses, right? Nothing wrong with having a cross around your neck or on your ink, right? But it's better to have a cross where? In your heart. That'd be the best place to have it. What else? What are other good luck charms? Bible's a good luck charm, right? I mean, in the South, it's so crazy. One of my pet peeves is people get these leather Bibles and they put them on the back. I don't know why. They put them in the back window sill ledge of their car. And it sits there and, 120 degree Pensacola sun, and it wilts and destroys it. And it's got 6 inches of dust on top, but it's a good luck charm, right? You're not going to have a car accident or something. What else? What are other good luck charms we have? Angels, yeah. If you have a lot of angels around your house or something, maybe then you'll really be protected. Again, nothing wrong with angelic artwork, but to look to them for protection, just like there's nothing wrong with the cross. What else? The Jesus fish, Christian T-shirts. There's a ton of things. The building, right? Shh, God's in here. Right? Relatives, yeah. You can have a trust. There's a lot of things we can put our trust in. The book begins with an undue trust in the Ark of the Covenant, but not the God of the Ark, which I think a lot of us, that's an issue for many of us, to trust in an object instead of the God that the sign or symbol point to. And so, in the beginning of Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant was taken. Israel was defeated in battle. They marched out with the Ark like a good luck charm. Instead of trusting in God with their hearts, they trust in the Ark. And this is one of my favorite stories. So, the Philistines defeat Israel, and they take the Ark away. And then to embarrass Yahweh, to embarrass our God, they take the Ark and they put it inside of the temple of their god Dagon. Now, Dagon is not Baal or Asherah. This is a particular Philistine deity. So notice what it says here. So they put the Ark of the Covenant of God in there. When they arose early in the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the Ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold, on the floor there. Only the trunk of the Dagon was left to him. This is why the priest of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod. What does he say? To this day. In other words, that happened a long time ago. And now, because this image that the Philistines worshipped, I mean, I love the irony here that God literally decapitated him and cut his hands off, right? So God said, don't treat me like Dagon. By the way, this is the same thing that is repeated later on in the book of Daniel. Do you remember how the book of Daniel begins? Daniel begins with the Babylonians marching into Judah, and they take the people of Judah, the Israelites, captive, but they also take something else in Daniel chapter 1. Does anyone remember? Not the ark, that's not mentioned. We don't know what happened to the ark. There's theories which we'll talk about when we get there. But what? The vessels. All of the cups and the plates from what? The temple. Okay? They were in the tabernacle, then in the temple. Now what's really cool is you go on a little later in the book of Daniel, and do you remember Belshazzar throws a big party? Remember that? A big drunken party. And everyone's drunk, and he actually says, let's get out the Jews' cups. And yeah, let's get all their stuff out that we've had captive all these years. And that's a defying statement. What he's doing by doing that is saying that I can eat off the God of Israel's plates and cups. Which, by the way, is what people do when they take the Lord's Supper, not as Christians. Same idea. And all of a sudden, God bursts into the scene supernaturally, and a hand shows up and starts writing on the wall, many, many tekel of Harson, right? What does that mean? Right? We need to get Daniel. Your kingdom's smoke. All right? If you take of this table unworthily, you drink damnation to yourself. 1 Corinthians. You put the Ark of the Covenant with Dagon. Dagon gets decapitated, and his hand, for good measure, would cut his hands off too, his arms off too. You know, just to show you how impotent he is. His hands can't defend himself, and he don't have a head anymore. Right? Don't mess with the God of Israel, the true God. Powerful, really powerful when you think about that. But in this instance, just because we're still in the historical part, not the theology, to this day, the author says. So I think that tells us that whoever's writing this is writing later on in history. Okay? Now, another example of this is in 2 Samuel chapter 18. So if you remember, unfortunately, one of David's great sins, the sin that really was the biggest sin of David, in my opinion, was his sin of not being able to control his sexuality. And that is because he commits affairs, he defies the law of God in Deuteronomy, and he marries more than one woman. He has multiple wives. And unfortunately, that sinful trait is passed on to his sons. And to his son Solomon. And so when you get to later in David's life, because David had multiple wives, he had multiple sons that were half-brothers. Now, there's nothing wrong with having half-brothers, except for when your dad's the king, right? Because jealousy starts to ensue. And unfortunately, all of David's heartache as king really came from his affairs and the adultery he had, because now he has sons trying to overthrow him as king, including this one here, Absalom. And he has, of course, sons trying to overthrow Solomon when Solomon is supposed to be the rightful leader, which we'll get in after 1 and 2 Samuel. We'll get to that in the beginning of 1 Kings. So notice what it says here. They took Absalom after he had rebelled against David, and he was killed. They threw him into a great pit in the forest, and they raised over him a great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, every one to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. So before Absalom rebelled against David, he set up this pillar in the king's valley to honor himself. He built his own monument. All right? It's never a good idea to build your own monument. Let someone else do it, okay? You see that all throughout the Bible. He called the pillar after his own name, and notice what it says. It is called Absalom's monument to this day. So whoever's writing, Absalom's long gone. He's been dead a long time. But the monument's still there, which tells me that David's probably still alive, I'm assuming. That's why it hasn't been knocked down, because I would imagine Solomon would have got rid of that thing, or he would have reconstituted or repurposed it. Or, especially if it was a later king, they would have said, get rid of that thing for sure. So, whoever's writing is writing later. There's one last point here to help us with the date, and we're just about done. And this point here makes me think that when the book was being completed, it was actually being completed after Solomon. So while I think Samuel and Nathan were definitely authors of the book, maybe Gad the seer as well, I think it's even completed after the time of Solomon. Or an editor comes, God raises up an editor to finish writing the book after the time of Solomon because of this next statement. So in 1 Samuel 27, verses 5 through 7, we have the story of David, and he, if you remember, is fleeing for his life from King Saul, and he's talking to the king of the Philistines here. And if you look here, it says, David said to Achish, this is the Philistine king, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of your country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So that day Achish gave him Ziklag. Therefore, now everyone pay attention to this, Ziklag has belonged to who? The kings of Judah to this day. Now wait a minute. Did Samuel know that there was going to be kings of Judah separate from Israel? No. Did Saul know that? No. Did David know that? No. Did Solomon know that? No. There was a united kingdom, right? There was no kings of Israel and kings of Judah during the reigns of Samuel, Saul, David, or Solomon. But after Solomon, remember, his son splits Israel in two. And so at that point, you have kings ruling in Judah. In fulfillment of 2 Samuel 7, you have kings ruling in the north in Israel. And this statement is making it clear that whoever is at least editing these verses or writing these verses, it's during the time that the nation has now been split into two. So it would be after Solomon. Because beforehand, they would have just said the kings of Israel, right? They wouldn't have said the kings of Judah. So a good conclusion is that multiple people wrote this book, put it together, and that it was probably edited under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So the real point here is this book is covering Israel's history from Samuel, his conception, until the end of David's reign. 1 and 2 Samuel go from Samuel the prophet to David's reign. And it's composed in several stages, and I want to end with this point. I think there's probably 3 stages to the composing of this book. I think you have the story of the Ark of the Covenant of God. In 1 Samuel, really from chapter 1 at the tabernacle through chapter 4, that's one big arrangement there that I think Samuel had a lot to do with. He's telling his own story. He's telling about what happened with the Ark of God. I think there's definitely a second big section there that someone's writing. It could be Samuel, it could be Nathan. The story of Saul and David. This is before David is made king. And I think there's probably one author who's recording that. I think the reason why the Septuagint broke up the book at 2 Samuel chapter 1 is because at that point you start to just have the story of David as the undivided king of Israel. And so I think it's possible that there was someone else who wrote that section of chapters 1 through 20. So these are 3 major sections of the book, and this is somewhat of a way to divide it. You could actually really go and divide it the period of the Judges, the period of Saul, the period of David. For an outline teaching purposes, if I was teaching it, I would say the beginning of the book is Samuel, the season of the Judges. The second season is Saul as king. The third season, or the third act, if you will, is David as king. So I'm going to stop right there tonight because we're going to get into the theology of this book and then 1 Kings next week. Any questions before we close out on any of this material? I know